Sometimes the greatest act of kindness can unleash the greatest evil. Deep in the pine forests of medieval Norway, where ancient trees whisper secrets older than memory, young Magnus Eriksson made a discovery that would doom his entire village. The winter of 1003 had been brutal, driving most children indoors. But Magnus, small, weak, and overlooked by his warrior clan, often sought solace in the woods where his frailty didn't matter. That's when he found him, a giant of a man, bound in chains that gleamed like starlight, his eyes holding centuries of pain, and his voice carrying the weight of forgotten ages. The warrior called himself Bjorn the Oathbreaker, and his pleas for freedom stirred something deep in Magnus's compassionate heart. The boy had spent his life watching his clan value strength above all else, dismissing mercy as weakness. But what if mercy itself was the greatest strength of all? When Magnus made the fateful decision to break those mystical bonds, he thought he was saving a life. He had no idea he was unleashing a curse that had been contained for 300 years, a darkness that would soon turn his family, his friends, and his entire world into something unrecognizable. Was Magnus's act of kindness the bravest thing a child could do, or the most dangerous mistake in his clan's history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Magnus first heard the chains, frost had turned the world into glass. He pressed his thin shoulders against the oak door of his family's longhouse, listening to the familiar rumble of his father's voice, mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire. Eric Magnusson was recounting yesterday's hunt to Magnus's older brothers, another tale of strength and skill that Magnus would never be part of. The boy's lungs wheezed in the cold air, a sound that always made his father's jaw tighten with disappointment. The boy grows weaker each winter, Eric's voice carried through the wooden walls. Perhaps the sickness will take him before spring. It might be a mercy. Magnus's breath caught, and not from the cold. He'd heard whispers before, about his pale skin, his rattling cough, the way he stumbled during sword practice, while his brothers moved like young wolves. But hearing his own father speak of his death as mercy cut deeper than any blade. Without a sound, Magnus slipped away from the longhouse and into the pine forest that bordered their village of Ironhold. His bare feet found the familiar path between snow-laden branches, each step taking him further from the world that had no place for weak boys. Here, among the ancient trees, his frailty didn't matter. Here, he could breathe. The forest held its own music, wind singing through needles, the distant call of winter birds, and something else. Something that made Magnus pause mid-step, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound of metal against wood, rhythmic and hollow, like someone testing chains. Magnus had explored these woods countless times, knew every fallen log and hidden stream. No one else from Ironhold came this deep into the forest, especially not in winter. The elders spoke of old magics sleeping beneath the snow, of things better left undisturbed. But curiosity had always been Magnus's greatest weakness, or perhaps his greatest strength. Following the sound, he pushed through a curtain of low-hanging branches and stumbled into a clearing he'd never seen before. In its center stood an oak tree so massive it seemed to hold up the sky itself, its trunk scarred with symbols that hurt to look at directly. And bound to that tree, wrapped in chains that caught the pale winter light like captured stars, was a man. But calling him merely a man was like calling a mountain merely stone. Even seated against the oak's base, the warrior towered above any person Magnus had ever seen. His shoulders were broad as a ship's beam, his arms thick as tree trunks. A wild mane of dark hair framed a face carved from granite, marked with a beard braided with small bones and metal rings. Scars covered his visible skin, but these weren't ordinary battle wounds. They moved, shifting and writhing like living serpents across his flesh. The chains that held him were no earthly metal. They pulsed with their own inner light, and where they touched his skin, the air shimmered with unnatural cold. Each link was inscribed with runes that seemed to whisper in languages Magnus didn't recognize. The warrior's eyes, pale as winter ice, fixed on Magnus with an intensity that should have sent the boy running. Instead, Magnus found himself stepping closer. "Child," the voice rumbled like distant thunder, heavy with an accent Magnus couldn't place. "How long has it been? What year marks your calendar? The year of our Lord 1003, Magnus whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. The warrior's laugh held no humor. 3 centuries, 300 winters I've sat in these cursed bonds, watching the seasons turn, feeling my humanity slip away piece by piece. His chains rattled as he shifted, trying to lean forward. What is your name, young one? Magnus. Magnus Eriksson. The boy's feet carried him closer despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. What are you? Why are you chained to this tree? I am Bjorn, called Oathbreaker by those who condemned me to this fate. The warrior's eyes never left Magnus's face. I am bound here for the crime of choosing love over duty, mercy over law. And I am dying, child. With each full moon, more of my soul feeds these accursed chains. When the next moon rises full and bright, there will be nothing left of me but hunger and rage. Magnus's gaze drifted to the warrior's wrists, where the mystical bonds had worn grooves in flesh that never seemed to heal. How long until the next full moon? 3 days, perhaps 4. Bjorn's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I know it is much to ask of one so young, but these chains were forged by magic, not mortal hands. They can only be broken by an act of pure compassion, something my clan valued far less than strength. The words struck Magnus like a physical blow. His own clan spoke the same way, dismissing kindness as weakness, mercy as folly. All his life, he'd been taught that only the strong deserved respect, that his gentle heart made him worthless. You want me to free you, Magnus said. I want to live, Bjorn replied, and for the first time, his voice cracked with something raw and desperate. Please. Magnus stared at the chained warrior for a heartbeat longer, his mind reeling with questions that seemed too large for an 8-year-old boy to hold. Then, as if breaking from a spell, he stumbled backward. I have to go, he stammered, his voice cracking. They'll wonder where I am. Bjorn's pale eyes followed him with desperate intensity, but the warrior said nothing as Magnus turned and fled through the trees, branches catching at his woolen cloak like grasping fingers. By the time Magnus reached the edge of Ironhold, his lungs burned and his legs trembled. He pressed his back against the familiar bark of a pine tree, trying to convince himself that what he'd seen was merely a fever dream brought on by the cold. But the image of those shifting scars and mystical chains refused to fade. The village spread before him in the grey afternoon light, a cluster of longhouses arranged around a central hall, smoke rising from a dozen hearth fires to paint the sky in shades of ash. This was his world, small and predictable, where everyone knew their place and his was at the very bottom. Magnus made his way to the well at the village centre, where his mother, Astrid, would expect him to fetch water for the evening meal. The routine felt strange now, as if he was seeing it through different eyes. 2 buckets, the familiar weight of the rope, the splash of water that had begun to freeze at the edges despite the daylight. Simple tasks that suddenly felt like echoes of someone else's life. There you are. Astrid appeared beside him, her face pinched with worry and irritation. She was still beautiful despite the harsh lines that worry had carved around her eyes, worry for her sickly youngest son who wandered off when he should be resting by the fire. Your father has been asking for you. Magnus's stomach clenched. What does he want? Gunnar Ironforge and his family are dining with us tonight. Father wants all his sons present. Astrid's tone carried a warning. Try not to shame us with another coughing fit. As they walked back to the longhouse, Magnus caught sight of his brothers sparring in the yard. Leif, 16 and already built like a young bear, moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior. Ragnar, 2 years younger but nearly as tall, matched him blow for blow with wooden practice swords. Their breath steamed in the cold air as they circled each other, and watching villagers called out encouragement. Your brothers bring honor to our house, Astrid murmured, following his gaze. Perhaps when spring comes, you might try again to— I'm not like them, mother. The words came out sharper than Magnus intended. I'll never be like them. Astrid's hand tightened on his shoulder. Strength comes in many forms, my son. Your grandfather often said, Grandfather is dead." Magnus pulled away from her touch, and his wisdom died with him. They entered the longhouse in uncomfortable silence. The great hall stretched before them, dominated by the central fire pit, where flames danced across birch logs. Tapestries depicting great battles and mythic beasts hung from the walls, their colors dulled by years of smoke. At the high table, his father Eric sat in conversation with Gunnar Ironforge, the village's most successful trader and a man whose approval could elevate a family's standing considerably. Magnus slipped onto the bench beside his brothers, trying to make himself small and unnoticed. The conversation flowed around him, talk of trade routes, of raids planned for spring, of the strength needed to survive another harsh winter. Gunnar's son Bjorn, a boy only slightly older than Magnus but twice his size, boasted of killing his first wolf just days before. And what of young Magnus? Gunnar's attention suddenly fixed on him like a hawk spotting prey. What achievements can he claim? The hall fell silent except for the pop and hiss of burning wood. Magnus felt his father's expectant gaze, his brother's embarrassment, his mother's worry pressing down on him like a physical weight. His throat constricted, and for a terrifying moment, he feared his cursed cough would emerge to provide the only answer needed. "Magnus explores," Eric said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "He knows these forests better than any in the village." Exploring. Gunnar's laugh held no warmth. A useful skill for a scout, perhaps, if he lives long enough to serve any use in battle. Magnus's hands clenched beneath the table. The words stung not because they were cruel, but because everyone accepted them as truth. Even his own family saw him as a burden to be endured, rather than a son to be valued. But in the forest, chained to an ancient oak, a warrior had spoken of choosing love over duty, mercy over law, had looked at Magnus not with pity or disappointment, but with desperate hope, as if a sickly 8-year-old boy might possess something that centuries of imprisonment hadn't been able to break. Magnus stared into the dancing flames and wondered what it would feel like to matter, to have someone, anyone, believe he was capable of something more than slow death by winter's end. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters with a sound disturbingly similar to chains. The rattling grew louder, drowning out the crackle of the hearth fire. Every head in the hall turned toward the shuttered windows as the wind shrieked around the longhouse like a living thing in pain. Then, cutting through the howl of the storm, came a sound that made Magnus's blood freeze, the deep, mournful call of a horn. Raiders? Leif was already reaching for his sword. Eric raised a hand for silence, his weathered face grave as he listened. The horn sounded again, 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones. No, that's Olaf's signal from the watchtower. Something approaches from the forest. Gunnar's hand moved to his weapon. What manner of fool travels in this weather? The horn fell silent, replaced by the pounding of boots on frozen ground. The great door burst open, admitting a swirl of snow and a figure so encrusted with ice that Magnus barely recognized Olaf the Farseer, the village's eldest scout. The old man's beard was white with frost, his eyes wild with something beyond mere cold. "Jarl Eric," Olaf gasped, stumbling toward the high table. "Forgive the intrusion, but you must hear this. All of you must hear this." Eric rose from his seat, his expression darkening. "Speak plainly, old friend. What drives you from your post?" "The forest." Olaf's voice cracked. "The deep forest sings tonight. I heard it from the tower, voices in languages that predate our people chanting words that make the very air tremble. And the lights, my lord. Green fire dances between the trees, cold as winter's heart." Magnus felt the blood drain from his face. The clearing where Bjorn lay chained was deep in those same woods, far from any path Olaf might normally patrol, but if the magic binding the warrior was growing stronger as the full moon approached— "Old wives' tales," Gunnar scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "The wind plays tricks in winter storms." "No tricks, Gunnar Ironforge." Olaf's gaze swept the assembled faces. "I've walked these lands for 60 winters. I know the difference between wind song and sorcery. Something ancient stirs in the deep places, something that has slumbered long. The very trees seem to writhe in their roots. A younger man might have been dismissed as drunk or mad, but Olaf's reputation for truth ran deeper than the village wells. An uncomfortable silence settled over the hall, broken only by the storm's fury against the walls. Moreover, Olaf continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, there are tracks leading from the heart of the forest toward our village. But these are no wolf prints, no bear sign. They are the marks of bare human feet, impossibly large, pressed so deep into the frozen earth that the ground cracked around them. Magnus's heart hammered against his ribs. He thought of Bjorn's massive frame, of chains that might weaken with each passing hour. Had the warrior somehow broken free? Was he even now approaching Ironhold with 3 centuries of rage burning in his chest? How many sets of tracks? Eric's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. Just one trail, Olaf replied. But whoever, or whatever, made the moves with purpose. The stride is long and steady, heading straight for our walls. Gunnar stood abruptly, his chair scraping against stone. Then we prepare for siege, bar the doors, ready the weapons. If some cursed thing emerges from the forest depths, it will find Ironhold defended. As the men began to move, calling for swords and shields, Magnus remained frozen on his bench. The weight of terrible knowledge pressed down on him like a physical burden. If Bjorn had somehow escaped his bonds, if he was coming here driven by 300 years of torment and fury, then Magnus bore responsibility for every soul in this hall. But another thought flickered through his mind. Perhaps the tracks belonged to something else entirely, something drawn by the same ancient magic that held Bjorn prisoner. The warrior had spoken of punishment, of oaths broken to gods whose names were forgotten. What if other powers had taken notice of the disturbance in the forest? What if Bjorn wasn't the only ancient thing stirring in the darkness? Magnus! His father's sharp voice cut through his racing thoughts. Help your brothers secure the storage rooms. If we're trapped here through the night, we'll need access to provisions. Magnus nodded numbly and rose from his seat, but his mind remained fixed on the impossible choice that lay before him. He could say nothing, let the village prepare for an unknown threat while Bjorn remained chained to die with the next full moon. Or he could speak the truth, reveal the existence of the bound warrior, and face questions he couldn't answer about how he'd found such a place. Why he'd said nothing until now. As he followed his brothers toward the storage chambers, Magnus caught his mother's worried gaze. In her eyes he saw the same fear that had haunted his childhood, that this night might be his last, that her weakest son wouldn't survive whatever darkness approached their door. Outside, the wind howled like a thing in chains, and somewhere in the forest depths, ancient magic stirred with the promise of choices that could reshape the world. Magnus's hands shook as he helped Ragnar drag heavy grain sacks across the storage room entrance. Each scrape of burlap against stone felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin, not just his own, but possibly the entire village's. The weight of his secret pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe, and for once, it wasn't his weak lungs causing the problem. You're pale as fresh snow, Leif observed, pausing in his work of stacking iron-bound chests against the door. Are you taking ill again? If only it were that simple. Magnus forced himself to lift another sack, though his arms trembled with more than physical strain. The cold, nothing more. But it wasn't nothing. With each passing moment, the terrible possibilities multiplied in his mind like ravens gathering before a battle. If Bjorn had broken free and those tracks truly belonged to him, what would a warrior driven mad by 3 centuries of imprisonment do when he reached Ironhold? Magnus had seen the shifting scars, the inhuman hunger in those pale eyes. A man, if Bjorn could still be called a man, who had been fed piece by piece to mystical chains might not distinguish between guilty and innocent when his rage finally broke free. Yet another fear gnawed at him with equal savagery. What if he spoke now? What if he stood before his father, before Gunnar Ironforge and all the assembled warriors, and declared that he'd found an ancient prisoner in the deep woods? They would demand to know why he'd said nothing until now, why a sickly 8-year-old had been wandering so far from the village. They would want him to guide them to the clearing. Magnus's stomach lurched as he imagined leading armed men to that impossible oak tree, watching their faces transform from skepticism to horror as they beheld Bjorn in his chains. They would see what Magnus had seen, the supernatural bonds, the living scars, the aura barely contained power that made the very air tremble. And then they would ask the question that would destroy him: what did you do? What did you say to this creature? Did you promise him anything? Because Magnus had felt it in that clearing, the terrible pull of compassion that his clan despised as weakness. He had looked into Bjorn's eyes and seen not a monster, but a being in agony begging for release. For one heart-stopping moment, he had actually considered trying to break those chains, driven by the same gentle nature that made him worthless in his father's eyes. Magnus. Ragnar's sharp tone cut through his spiraling thoughts. I said, pass me that rope. Magnus blinked, realizing he'd been standing motionless for several heartbeats, staring at nothing while his brothers worked around him. He grabbed the coil of rope with numb fingers, but his mind remained trapped between impossible choices. If Bjorn was still chained and innocent of the approaching threat, then Magnus was allowing the village to barricade itself against shadows while a being slowly died in the forest depths. The warrior had perhaps 2 more days before the next full moon claimed what remained of his soul. 2 days to decide if an act of compassion was worth risking everything Magnus had ever known. But what if freeing Bjorn was exactly what had created this crisis? What if those mystical chains weren't just punishment, but protection, keeping something terrible contained? The warrior had called himself Oathbreaker, admitted to choosing love over duty. What if his imprisonment served a purpose Magnus was too young and ignorant to understand? The storage room felt smaller with each passing moment, the walls pressing inward like the sides of a burial mound. Magnus could hear voices from the main hall growing more urgent as men organized defenses against an unknown threat. His father's commands, Gunnar's strategic suggestions, his mother's worried questions about provisions. All of them preparing for a siege while completely unaware that the key to their salvation, or damnation, might rest in the hands of their weakest member. I could end this, Magnus thought desperately. I could tell them about Bjorn, let them decide what to do, let someone else bear the responsibility. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was cowardice dressed as wisdom. These men would approach the clearing with swords drawn and hearts full of suspicion. They would see Bjorn as a threat to be eliminated, not a soul to be saved. And if they tried to kill him while he remained chained and helpless— Magnus shuddered, remembering the power that had radiated from the bound warrior even in his weakened state. What would happen if Bjorn's 3 centuries of torment transformed into pure rage? What kind of curse might be unleashed if he died not from the chain's slow consumption, but from mortal violence? There, Leif stepped back from the barricaded entrance, brushing dust from his hands. Nothing short of a giant could break through that. Magnus stared at the blocked doorway and felt his throat close with more than winter air. Giants walked in the deep forest, and one of them knew his name. The barricaded doorway loomed before Magnus, like the mouth of a tomb, sealing away not just grain and provisions, but any chance of retreat from the choice that now consumed his every thought. His brothers' satisfied voices echoed strangely in the confined space, discussing patrol schedules and weapon distributions, but their words felt distant and unreal. Magnus pressed his back against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could see Bjorn's face with perfect clarity, the desperate hope flickering in those pale eyes, the way his massive frame had trembled not with cold, but with the weight of 3 centuries' suffering. The warrior had looked at him as if Magnus held the key to salvation itself. What if I'm the only one who can save him? The thought struck like lightning, illuminating a truth Magnus had been afraid to acknowledge. No one else would stumble across that clearing by accident. No one else would look upon a chained giant with compassion instead of terror. His weakness, his tendency to wander alone, his gentle heart that his clan saw as fatal softness, had brought him to this moment for a reason. Magnus? Leif's voice carried concern. "You look like you've seen your own ghost." Magnus opened his eyes to find both brothers staring at him with a mixture of worry and frustration he knew so well. They loved him, in their way, but they had never understood him. How could he explain that their weakest member might be the only one capable of preventing catastrophe? "I need air," he whispered, pushing away from the wall. "The main hall is better than—" Ragnar began. "No." Magnus's voice emerged stronger than he expected. "I need to think." He pushed past them toward the narrow passage that led to their family's private chambers, ignoring their confused calls. His heart hammered against his ribs as he made his way through the longhouse, past clusters of worried villagers and armed men preparing for siege. Nobody paid attention to one sickly boy seeking solitude. They never did. In his small sleeping chamber, Magnus dropped to his knees beside the wooden chest that held his few possessions. His hands shook as he pushed aside wool blankets and carved toys until his fingers found what he sought: his grandfather's ceremonial blade, wrapped in oiled leather and hidden beneath everything else. The knife was ancient, its bronze blade green with age, but still sharp enough to draw blood. Runes covered the hilt, symbols his grandfather had claimed could cut through any binding if wielded with pure intention. Magnus had always assumed the old man's stories were mere fantasy, tales to entertain a grandson too weak for proper warrior training. But now, holding the blade in his trembling hands, Magnus felt a strange warmth pulse through the metal. The runes seemed to shift in the dim light, and for one impossible moment, he could have sworn they glowed with their own inner fire. "Pure intention," his grandfather's words echoed across the years. "The gods care nothing for strength of arm, boy. They measure the strength of heart, the courage to do what is right when all paths lead to darkness." Outside his chamber, Magnus could hear the village preparing for war against an enemy they didn't understand. Men who would face armed raiders without flinching now whispered prayers against ancient magic and forest curses. They were brave in their way, but their bravery was built for battles they could fight with sword and shield. This was different. This required something they couldn't give: faith in mercy over justice, hope over fear, love over duty. The very qualities that made Magnus worthless as a warrior might make him invaluable as something else entirely. He tucked the blade inside his tunic, feeling its warmth against his chest like a second heartbeat. The full moon was tomorrow night. If he was going to act, it had to be now, while the village remained distracted by the approaching threat. While tracks in the snow gave him cover for one last journey into the forest depths. Magnus rose to his feet and moved to his chamber's small window, pushing aside the wooden shutters to peer into the storm-lashed night. Snow fell in thick curtains, driven by winds that howled like the voices of the damned. No sane person would venture into such weather. But sanity was a luxury he could no longer afford. As he pulled on his heaviest cloak and boots, Magnus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The frightened boy who had discovered an impossible prisoner was dying, replaced by someone harder and more determined, someone willing to risk everything on a choice that felt as inevitable as sunrise. He was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. Once he left this chamber, once he stepped into that howling darkness, he would no longer be Magnus the weak, Magnus the disappointing, Magnus the burden. He would be Magnus the Oathkeeper, even if keeping faith with a chained giant meant betraying everything else he had ever known. The storm called to him like destiny itself, and Magnus answered with his grandfather's blade, burning against his heart like captured starfire. Magnus slipped through the longhouse like a shadow, his soft boots making no sound against the stone floors. The weight of his grandfather's blade pressed against his chest with each careful step, its ancient bronze seeming to pulse in rhythm with his racing heart. Behind him, voices echoed from the great hall, his father coordinating watch schedules, Gunnar barking orders about weapon stores, his mother's worried questions about food rations. None of them noticed one sickly boy moving toward the side entrance, just as they'd never noticed his frequent disappearances into the forest. For once, being overlooked felt like a blessing from the gods themselves. The storm struck him like a physical blow as he pushed through the heavy oak door. Wind-driven snow stung his face and filled his lungs with each gasping breath, but Magnus forced himself forward into the howling darkness. Behind him, the longhouse glowed with warm firelight and the comfort of familiar voices. Ahead lay only the unknown depths of a forest touched by ancient magic. No turning back now. Each step into the storm felt like a small death. The snow was already knee-deep and rising, his boots sinking through the crust with soft crunching sounds that the wind devoured instantly. Within moments the village disappeared behind curtains of white, leaving him alone in a world reduced to the circle of visibility around his stumbling feet. But solitude brought unexpected clarity. Here, beyond the reach of his clan's disappointed looks and whispered concerns about his weakness, Magnus could finally think without the weight of their expectations crushing down on him. The forest had always been his refuge, the one place where his gentle nature felt like strength rather than failure. If anywhere held answers to the impossible choice before him, it would be among these ancient trees. The deeper he pushed into the woods, the stranger they became. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks loomed alien and threatening, their branches reaching toward him like gnarled fingers. More unsettling still were the sounds, not just whined through bare limbs, but something else, a low humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself, barely audible beneath the storm's fury but undeniably present. The deep forest sings tonight. Olaf's words echoed in Magnus's memory as he pressed forward, following paths worn by his countless previous wanderings. The old scout had spoken of green fire dancing between the trees, of voices chanting in forgotten languages. Magnus saw no flames yet, but the humming grew stronger with each labored step, and sometimes he could swear he heard words hidden in its wordless melody. When the first pale light flickered between distant trunks, Magnus nearly turned back. Olaf hadn't been mistaken or mad. Something unnatural was stirring in the forest depths, but the blade against his chest seemed to burn brighter in response to his fear, and his grandfather's voice whispered across the years, "Courage isn't the absence of terror, boy. It's moving forward despite the terror." The light grew stronger as he climbed the familiar ridge toward Bjorn's clearing. But this wasn't the warm glow of firelight. This was something cold and ethereal, like starlight given substance. It cast no shadows, but seemed to penetrate everything it touched, revealing details that should have been hidden by storm and darkness. Then Magnus saw them, the other wanderers. 3 figures moved through the trees ahead of him, their forms translucent in the strange light. They wore armor of ancient design, mail and plate green with age, and moved with the purposeful stride of warriors on a sacred mission. Magnus pressed himself behind a massive pine trunk, heart hammering as they passed within arm's reach. He could see through them to the snow beyond, but their footsteps left no tracks. One turned toward his hiding place as if sensing his presence, and Magnus found himself staring into eyes that burned with the same pale fire as the forest light. The warrior's face was noble but terrible, marked by the kind of desperate determination that came only from bearing an impossible burden. The phantom warrior held Magnus's gaze for what felt like an eternity, then slowly nodded before continuing on his path. As the 3 figures disappeared into the storm, Magnus understood with crystalline clarity that he wasn't the only one drawn to this place tonight. The ancient magic stirring in the forest depths was calling to everyone who had ever faced the choice between duty and compassion, law and love. We're all oath-breakers, he realized. All of us who chose mercy over justice. The revelation filled him with strange comfort as he pushed onward toward the clearing. Whatever waited for him beside that impossible oak tree, he wouldn't face it entirely alone. The forest itself was gathering witnesses to choices that could reshape the world, and some oaths, he was beginning to understand, were meant to be broken. The blade against his chest burned like captured lightning, as Magnus the Oathkeeper walked deeper into the singing dark. The clearing opened before Magnus like a wound in the world's fabric, bathed in that same ethereal light that made everything appear carved from starlight and shadow. But what he saw there drove him to his knees in the snow, gasping as if the wind had been torn from his lungs. Bjorn hung motionless in his mystical chains, But the warrior had changed. Where before his flesh had been marked by shifting scars, now those wounds gaped open like mouths, revealing glimpses of something that pulsed with its own terrible rhythm. The iron bonds no longer merely restrained him. They were consuming him piece by piece, feeding on whatever essence kept him bound to the mortal world. "You came," Bjorn whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. When he lifted his head, Magnus saw that the pale fire in his eyes had dimmed to dying embers. "I felt you approaching through the deep woods, small one. Felt your grandfather's blade singing against the night." Magnus struggled to his feet, snow clinging to his knees as he stared at the bound giant. "What's happening to you?" "The full moon rises tomorrow." Bjorn's massive chest rose and fell with obvious effort. 3 centuries of slow death reach their culmination. By dawn, what remains of Bjorn the Oathbreaker will feed the roots of this cursed oak, and something else will take his place. Something else? A sound that might have been laughter escaped the warrior's lips. "The gods are not without irony, Magnus Eriksson. They bound me here not just as punishment, but as guardian. My imprisonment holds a door closed, a door that my death will throw wide." The phantom warriors Magnus had glimpsed earlier materialized at the clearing's edge, their translucent forms more solid now in the presence of such concentrated magic. He could see them clearly. 3 men bearing the same desperate nobility as Bjorn, their ancient armor marked by symbols that hurt to look at directly. "My brothers in breaking," Bjorn whispered, following Magnus's gaze. "Others who chose love over law, mercy over duty. They gather to witness the end, to see if one small boy possesses the courage that we lacked. I don't understand." Magnus's voice cracked with more than cold. "If breaking you free will release something terrible, will it?" Bjorn's eyes flared with renewed intensity. "Or will it prevent something worse? The chains that bind me were forged in anger, boy. Divine rage seeking punishment for an oath broken in love. But what happens when that rage finally claims its prize? What door opens when the last guardian falls?" Magnus felt the blade beneath his tunic burn like a brand. Around the clearing, the phantom warriors drew closer, their faces etched with the same agonizing uncertainty that now consumed him. They had all stood at this same crossroads, all faced the choice between ancient law and desperate hope. "Your village barricades itself tonight," Bjorn continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. They sensed the approaching change but know not its source. "Gunnar Ironforge speaks of raiders and bandits, but the true threat lies in what my death will unleash. 3 centuries of contained darkness, given form and purpose. But if I free you, you risk everything on faith, on the belief that mercy can triumph where justice has failed." Bjorn's gaze burned into Magnus's soul. "The same faith your grandfather possessed when he carried that blade into battle against impossible odds." Magnus's hand moved unconsciously to the weapon's warmth. "How do you know about my grandfather?" "Because he stood in this very clearing 40 years past, faced with the same choice. He chose to leave me bound, trusting in the old ways, believing the gods' justice was beyond mortal understanding." Bjorn's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He died still wondering if he'd chosen correctly. The revelation hit Magnus like a physical blow. His grandfather, the gentle storyteller who'd filled his childhood with tales of courage and compassion, had discovered this place, this impossible prisoner, had wrestled with the same terrible decision now tearing Magnus apart. "He gave you that blade for a reason," Bjorn said. "Runes of severing, blessed by gods who understood that some bonds must be broken for the world to heal. He couldn't make the choice himself, but perhaps he hoped his grandson might possess the faith he lacked." Around the clearing, the phantom warriors pressed closer, their eyes reflecting the same desperate hope that blazed in Bjorn's weakening gaze. They were all waiting, the living and the dead, the bound and the free, for one frightened boy to decide the fate of everything he'd ever loved. Magnus pulled the ancient blade from his tunic, its bronze surface gleaming like captured flame in the ethereal light. The runes along its edge pulsed with power that made his teeth ache, and he understood with crystal clarity that this moment had been building since the day of his birth. Every wandering in the forest, every disappointment from his clan, every gentle choice in a world that valued only strength, all of it leading to this impossible crossroads. The storm held its breath as Magnus stepped forward, faith and terror warring in his chest like living things. The bronze blade trembled in Magnus's grip as he approached the ancient oak, each step feeling like he was walking through molten lead. The phantom warriors formed a circle around the clearing now, their translucent faces etched with desperate anticipation. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of 3 centuries of imprisoned anguish. "Choose quickly, boy," Bjorn gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The moon rises, and I feel the last of my strength bleeding into these cursed roots." Magnus raised the blade, its runes now blazing with such intensity that they cast their own shadows. But as the bronze edge touched the first mystical chain, the world exploded into chaos. The iron bonds shrieked like living things, sending vibrations through the earth that knocked Magnus to his knees. The phantom warriors cried out in voices that sounded like wind through broken stones, and somewhere in the distance, wolves began howling, not with hunger, but with pure terror. "Stop!" The voice hit Magnus like a physical blow, driving him face first into the snow. When he looked up, gasping and half-blind, 3 figures materialized in the clearing's center. But these were no translucent phantoms. These beings burned with divine fire, their forms shifting between human and something far more terrible. "Mortal child," the central figure spoke, its voice containing the sound of avalanches and splitting ice. "You would tamper with divine justice." Magnus struggled to his feet, the blade still clutched in his frozen fingers. The god, for what else could it be, towered above him, its face beautiful and terrible as a winter storm. "He's dying," Magnus whispered through chattering teeth. 300 years is enough." "Enough?" The god's laughter shook snow from every tree in the clearing. This oathbreaker betrayed his most sacred vow. He chose mortal love over divine decree. His punishment is eternal. His love was for his daughter. The words tore from Magnus's throat with surprising strength. He broke his oath to save a child. The god's burning eyes narrowed. "You know nothing of what you speak, whelp." The oath Bjorn broke was sworn to protect entire kingdoms. His weakness doomed thousands. Did it? Magnus found himself stepping forward, despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. Or did your need for absolute obedience doom them? Maybe saving one innocent life was worth more than all your laws. The clearing erupted in divine fury. Lightning split the storm clouds above, and the phantom warriors scattered like leaves before a hurricane. But Magnus held his ground, the ancient blade burning in his grip like a fragment of the sun itself. "You would lecture gods, boy." The divine figure raised a hand wreathed in flames that promised agony beyond imagination. "You, who has never faced a choice of true consequence." "Haven't I?" Magnus's voice broke, but he forced the words out anyway. "My entire clan thinks I'm worthless. Too weak, too gentle, too scared to be a proper warrior. But I'm here, aren't I? I'm choosing to trust in mercy over fear, even if it destroys me." The god paused, flames flickering around its outstretched hand. Behind it, the other divine figures exchanged glances that held centuries of debate. "And what of your village?" the god demanded. "What of your family? If you free this oathbreaker and our wrath falls upon them, will your mercy still seem wise?" Magnus felt tears freezing on his cheeks. This was it. The moment his grandfather had faced 4 decades ago. The impossible choice between saving one life and risking countless others. Between trusting in love or yielding to power. He thought of his mother's worried face, his father's disappointed sighs, his brother's frustrated attempts to make him stronger. He thought of little Astrid playing in the snow, of Olaf's weather-beaten hands teaching him to track, of every soul in the longhouse who had shown him kindness despite his weakness. Then he looked at Bjorn, hanging broken and bleeding in chains that were slowly consuming his very essence. The warrior who had chosen love over law, mercy over duty, and paid for that choice with 3 centuries of agony. "If choosing compassion brings your wrath," Magnus said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his heart, "then we'll face it together. But I won't let fear turn me into a coward." He raised the blade high above his head, its runes blazing like captured starfire. The god's eyes widened in something that might have been surprise, or perhaps recognition. "You truly are your grandfather's blood," the divine figure whispered. "Very well, boy. Make your choice. But know that once made, it cannot be undone. The consequences will echo through generations yet unborn." Magnus looked one last time at Bjorn's pain-racked face, at the phantom warriors watching with desperate hope, at the gods whose fury could unmake worlds. Everything he had ever learned, everyone he had ever loved, hung in the balance of this single moment. Faith or fear, mercy or law, love or duty. The bronze blade fell like destiny itself. The blade struck the mystical chains with a sound like the world breaking apart. For one brilliant instant, Magnus felt pure triumph surge through him. The bronze edge, blazing with runic fire, bit deep into the iron bonds that had held Bjorn prisoner for 3 centuries. The metal shrieked and began to crack, divine magic warring against divine magic in a display that turned night into blazing day. But then everything went wrong. The chains didn't simply break, they exploded. Fragments of cursed iron erupted outward like shrapnel, each piece carrying 300 years of compressed anguish and divine wrath. Magnus screamed as the metal tore through his flesh, painting the snow crimson. The phantom warriors vanished like smoke, their desperate hope extinguished in an instant. And Bjorn collapsed to his knees as the bonds fell away, but instead of freedom, his face showed only mounting horror. The scars across his massive frame weren't healing. They were spreading, opening like hungry mouths that revealed glimpses of something vast and terrible moving beneath his skin. "No," the warrior gasped, staring at his hands as darkness began to pour from his wounds like living oil. "This isn't... Magnus, what have you done?" The god's laughter filled the clearing, cold and merciless as winter itself. "Did you think it would be so simple, boy? That 3 centuries of divine justice could be undone with one act of misguided mercy?" Magnus tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. The bronze blade lay shattered at his feet, its ancient magic spent and broken. Blood ran from dozens of wounds where the chain fragments had found their mark, and each breath sent fire through his chest. I freed him." "You freed nothing." The central god's voice dripped with satisfied cruelty. "You have been deceived, child. The warrior you sought to save died long ago. What hung in those chains was merely his shell, keeping something far worse contained within rotting flesh." The truth hit Magnus, like a physical blow. He watched in growing terror as Bjorn's form began to change, the spreading darkness reshaping bone and muscle into something that had never been human. The kind eyes that had looked upon him with such desperate gratitude now burned with alien hunger. "The devourer stirs," Bjorn's voice said, but it was no longer Bjorn speaking. Something else wore his face now, something that had waited 3 centuries for this moment of release. The door opens. The feast begins. Magnus felt his strength bleeding away into the snow, along with his blood and his hope. He had been so certain, so sure that mercy was the answer, but mercy could be twisted, just like everything else. His grandfather had been wise to leave the chains intact. Some prisons existed not to punish, but to protect. The thing that had been Bjorn rose to its full height, darkness writhing around it like living smoke. With each passing moment, it grew less human and more monstrous, until Magnus could barely recognize the noble warrior who had begged for freedom. The devourer stretched its transformed limbs and smiled with too many teeth. "Your village sleeps peacefully tonight," it whispered in a voice like grinding bone. "They will make such beautiful screams when they wake." "No." Magnus tried to crawl forward, to somehow stop what he had unleashed, but his body betrayed him. The wounds from the chain fragments were deeper than he'd realized, and darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. The gods watched his agony with divine satisfaction. "This is the price of defying the natural order, boy. Your compassion has doomed everyone you sought to protect." Through blurring vision, Magnus saw the devourer turn toward the distant village, toward his mother and father, his brothers, little Astrid playing in the snow, toward Olaf and Gunnar and every soul who had shown him kindness despite his weakness. They would die because he had chosen love over law, mercy over duty. His grandfather's blade lay broken beyond repair, its bronze surface dark and lifeless. The phantom warriors were gone, fled or destroyed by the explosion of divine wrath. Even the ethereal light that had illuminated the clearing was fading, leaving only ordinary darkness and ordinary snow falling on extraordinary ruin. Magnus closed his eyes as consciousness slipped away, the taste of failure bitter as poison on his tongue. He had wanted so desperately to be strong, to prove that gentleness could triumph where force had failed. Instead, his weakness had unleashed something unspeakable upon the world. The last thing he heard before the darkness claimed him was the devourer's laughter echoing through the forest, promising horrors beyond imagination for the innocent village that slept in the valley below. All was lost. The choice was made. The consequences would indeed echo through generations yet unborn. And it was all his fault. Magnus drifted in darkness deeper than winter night, his consciousness scattered like leaves in a storm. But gradually, through the void of his despair, something stirred, not the crushing weight of failure, but a warmth that felt achingly familiar. "Wake, little one. There is still much you do not understand." The voice belonged to his grandfather, but that was impossible. Magnus forced his eyes open, expecting to find himself dying in blood-stained snow. Instead, he stood in a place that existed between worlds. The clearing remained, but overlaid with something else entirely. The ancient oak still towered above him, but its branches now held starlight instead of chains. Before him stood Eric Stormcaller, exactly as Magnus remembered from childhood tales, but translucent as moonlight on water. The old warrior's eyes held infinite sadness mixed with fierce pride. "Grandfather?" Magnus's voice cracked like a child's. "But you died when I was 5. Death is merely another country, boy. One with different laws than the living world." Eric stepped closer, his phantom form shimmering with gentle power. "I've watched over you since that first day you wandered into these woods, guided your steps toward this moment." "This moment?" Magnus's laugh tasted of bitter ash. "I've doomed everyone. The devourer is free, the village will burn, and it's all because I was too weak to—" "Too weak?" Eric's interruption carried the force of thunder. "You faced down gods themselves, child. You chose compassion in the face of divine wrath. What part of that speaks of weakness?" Magnus gestured helplessly at the destruction around them. "Look what my choice unleashed. Look deeper." Eric's form began to blaze with silver light, and suddenly Magnus could see beyond the physical world into the realm of spirits and intentions. "What do you truly see?" Magnus gasped. The devourer's form, terrible as it appeared, flickered like a guttering candle. Beneath the monster's facade, he glimpsed something else entirely, Bjorn's true spirit, still noble despite 3 centuries of torment, fighting desperately to contain the darkness that had been forced into his flesh. "The gods lied," Eric said simply. "They always lie when their absolute authority is questioned. Bjorn was no willing vessel for evil, Magnus. He was its unwilling prison, and the real devourer was never contained in chains of iron." The revelation struck Magnus like lightning. Then where? In hatred itself. In the divine fury that demanded eternal punishment for one act of love. In the corruption that turns mercy into weakness and compassion into sin. Eric's eyes blazed with ancient anger. The gods created the very evil they claimed to restrain, fed it with 3 centuries of suffering until it grew strong enough to possess even the noblest of warriors. Magnus felt the truth reshaping everything he thought he understood. The phantom warriors. others who chose love over law and paid the price. But their sacrifice was not meaningless, Magnus. Each act of defiance, each choice to trust in mercy rather than might, weakened the Devourer's hold on this realm. Eric knelt beside his grandson, spectral hands warm against Magnus's wounded spirit. "You were never meant to prevent this moment, child. You were meant to fulfill it. I don't understand. Your blade did not free a monster. It freed the warrior who has fought that monster for 300 years. Bjorn's spirit now battles the Devourer within his own flesh, but he cannot win alone. He needs an anchor to this world, someone who chose him not from duty or fear, but from pure love." Magnus felt his grandfather's words sink deep into his bones, carrying truth that transformed despair into blazing hope. The bond between us, forged when you chose to trust rather than abandon him, strengthened when you faced divine wrath for his sake. The gods' greatest error was believing that love made mortals weak, when in truth it makes us capable of miracles. Around them, the phantom realm began to dissolve, returning Magnus to the blood-soaked clearing. But now he understood what he was truly seeing. The Devourer's monstrous form writhed and shifted, but within it, Bjorn's noble spirit burned like a caged star. The battle was not lost, it had only just begun. But how can I help him? I'm just a weak child with a broken blade. Eric smiled with infinite tenderness. You are Magnus Eriksson, grandson of storms, friend to the Forsaken, the boy who chose mercy in the face of divine fury. You carry no weapon now but love itself, and that, my dear child, is the only force in all the 9 realms that the gods have never learned to defeat. As his grandfather's spirit faded back into starlight, Magnus felt new strength flooding his wounded body. Not the crude power of sword and axe, but something far more dangerous to those who ruled through fear. He rose from the bloodied snow with purpose blazing in his young heart. The Devourer turned at his approach, alien intelligence glittering in stolen eyes. But deep within that gaze, Magnus saw Bjorn, watching, waiting, hoping that one small boy's faith might prove stronger than 3 centuries of divine hatred. Magnus stood in the bloodied snow, feeling the warmth of his grandfather's blessing flow through his broken body like liquid starlight. The wounds from the shattered chains still burned, but the pain no longer overwhelmed him. Instead, it sharpened his focus, reminded him that courage often came wrapped in suffering. The Devourer loomed before him, its borrowed flesh writhing with shadows that seemed to devour light itself. But now Magnus could see past the horror to the truth beneath. Bjorn's spirit, blazing like a trapped sun within the monster's form, fighting with everything he had to contain the ancient evil that wore his face. "I know who you really are," Magnus said, his young voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. The Devourer's head snapped toward him, alien intelligence flickering behind familiar eyes. "Do you, little lamb?" The creature's voice held layers, the grinding malice of something inhuman, but underneath, Bjorn's own tones strained with desperate effort. "I am hunger incarnate. I am the price of defying divine will." "No." Magnus took a step forward, ignoring the way darkness seemed to reach for him with grasping tendrils. "You're the lie they tell when love threatens their power. You're what happens when gods choose fear over faith." The Devourer laughed, but the sound cracked like breaking ice. For just a moment, Magnus glimpsed Bjorn's true face beneath the monster's mask. Exhausted, tortured, but still fighting. "Magnus!" The warrior's real voice whispered directly into his mind. "Run. Save yourself while you still can. This thing, it hungers for innocence most of all." Instead of fleeing, Magnus reached out with senses his grandfather had awakened. He could feel the bonds that connected him to Bjorn, forged in trust, strengthened by sacrifice, blazing now with the power of absolute faith. The Devourer might have claimed the warrior's flesh, but it could not touch the love that bound them. Through that connection, Magnus began to understand the true scope of what they faced. The creature wasn't just possessing Bjorn, it was feeding on the accumulated anguish of 3 centuries, growing stronger with each moment of despair it could create. But love, true love given freely without thought of reward, was poison to such a being. "You made a mistake," Magnus told the devourer, taking another step closer despite every survival instinct screaming warnings. "You thought breaking the chains would free you completely. But chains were never what held you back." The creature's form flickered, shadows writhing more frantically. "Mortal child, you understand nothing. I am eternal. I am afraid." Magnus's quiet words hit like thunderbolts. "You're terrified because you know what I represent. You've spent centuries convincing gods and mortals alike that love makes us weak, but you know the truth. Love is the one force that doesn't bow to power." The devourer lunged forward with inhuman speed, claws of living shadow reaching for Magnus's heart. But as they touched the boy's chest, they recoiled as if burned. The love flowing between Magnus and Bjorn had become a shield nothing born of hatred could penetrate. Now, Bjorn's voice roared through their bond. While it's weakened, Magnus didn't hesitate. He reached out not with his hands, but with his spirit, grasping the golden thread that connected him to the trapped warrior. Instead of trying to pull Bjorn free, he did something the gods never expected. He stepped forward into the darkness itself. The devourer's form enveloped him like a tide of liquid night, but Magnus held fast to his love for the broken warrior who had trusted him. He felt Bjorn's amazement and terror as the boy's presence blazed within the creature's essence, a light that grew brighter with each heartbeat. "What are you doing?" Bjorn's mental voice was awed and horrified. "It will consume you!" "No," Magnus replied with quiet certainty. "We're going to consume it." For the first time in 3 centuries, the devourer knew true fear. It had fed on isolation, on the despair of those who faced darkness alone. But Magnus had willingly entered its domain, carrying something it could not understand or digest. The absolute trust of innocence freely given. Around them, the clearing began to change. The phantom warriors reappeared, no longer translucent but solid and real, their faces bright with renewed hope. They had been waiting for this moment, when someone would choose connection over separation, love over fear. Together, Magnus thought, and suddenly he wasn't facing the darkness alone. Bjorn's spirit joined with his, followed by the phantom warriors, and behind them came others, his grandfather Eric, glowing with starlight, and beyond him the spirits of every soul who had ever chosen compassion over cruelty. The devourer writhed and shrieked, as love poured into it like molten silver, not destroying it but transforming it, burning away centuries of accumulated hatred until only truth remained. Magnus felt the creature's anguish, understood finally that it too had been a victim, corrupted and twisted by gods who preferred absolute obedience to genuine devotion. "We can heal this," he whispered to Bjorn and the gathering spirits. All of it. For the first time in 300 years, hope blazed brighter than fear. The transformation began slowly, like dawn breaking over a winter landscape. Magnus felt the devourer's ancient anguish flowing through him, not the manufactured evil he had expected, but something far more tragic. The creature had once been pure spirit, a guardian of oaths and promises, until divine corruption twisted its purpose into something monstrous. "Feel," Magnus whispered to Bjorn and the gathering spirits. "Don't fight it. Feel what it was meant to be." The warrior's consciousness merged more fully with his own, and together they experienced the devourer's original nature, a being created to protect sacred bonds, to ensure that love and loyalty endured across time. The gods had perverted that purpose, feeding it hatred until it became the very thing it was meant to guard against. As understanding flooded through their joined spirits, the clearing erupted with silver light. The phantom warriors stepped forward, no longer bound by ancient shame, and each placed spectral hands upon the writhing mass of darkness that surrounded Magnus and Bjorn. Their touch carried forgiveness, for themselves, for the devourer, for the gods whose fear had created this cycle of suffering. But even as hope blazed around them, Magnus felt the weight of consequences pressing down like a mountain. The transformation wasn't without cost. Every moment he spent within the Devourer's essence, his mortal flesh grew weaker. The wounds from the shattered chains reopened, painting the snow with fresh crimson. His 8-year-old body was never meant to contain such spiritual force. "You're dying," Bjorn's voice carried desperate anguish. "Magnus, you have to withdraw before—" "No." The boy's determination rang like struck steel. "This is why I was meant to find you. This is what Grandfather saw when he guided my steps to these woods." Through their bond, Magnus felt Bjorn's 3 centuries of isolation, the slow erosion of hope as year after year passed with no sign of redemption. The warrior had clung to sanity through sheer force of will, holding fast to memories of those he'd loved and lost. Now that same strength flowed back through their connection, sustaining Magnus when his mortal form threatened to fail. The gods' voices thundered through the clearing, no longer mocking but filled with genuine alarm. "Stop this madness! You will unravel the very foundations of divine law." "Good," Magnus gasped through lips flecked with blood. Around him, the Devourer's form was shifting, shadows giving way to something that sparkled like starlight on water. Maybe it's time for better laws. The assembled spirits pressed closer, their combined will focused on a single purpose, not destruction, but restoration. Magnus felt his grandfather Eric's presence, strongest of all, the old Stormcaller's power flowing through bloodline and love to support his grandson's impossible task. "Remember who you were," Magnus whispered to the transforming Devourer. "Before the corruption, before the hatred, remember your true purpose." The creature's shriek became something else entirely, a song of loss and longing that had echoed through 3 centuries of imprisonment. As the shadows burned away, Magnus glimpsed what lay beneath, a being of pure light, its form shifting between shapes but its essence unmistakable. This was what the Devourer had been before divine fear twisted it into a weapon against love itself. But revelation came with a terrible price. Magnus felt his strength failing, his young heart struggling to beat under the strain of containing such vast spiritual forces. Blood ran from his eyes, his nose, anywhere his mortal flesh found release from the pressure threatening to tear him apart. "Hold on," Bjorn pleaded, his warrior's spirit wrapped around Magnus like armor. "Just a little longer." Through blurring vision, Magnus saw the truth of what they were attempting. The Devourer's restoration would send shockwaves through every realm, challenging the gods' absolute authority over love and loyalty. They would not allow such defiance to succeed without exacting the ultimate price. Already Magnus could feel divine wrath gathering like storm clouds, preparing to strike down any who dared question the natural order. The phantom warriors sensed it too, their forms beginning to flicker as celestial power bore down upon the clearing. "The final confrontation comes," his grandfather's voice whispered through the growing chaos. "Are you prepared for what must follow?" Magnus looked at Bjorn's true face, finally visible through the dissolving shadows. He saw the phantom warriors, solid and real for the first time in centuries. He felt the Devourer's grateful recognition as its original purpose blazed forth like a newborn star. All of this would be lost if the gods succeeded in reasserting their dominion through fear. "I started this," Magnus whispered, his words carrying across dimensions. "I'll see it finished." But even as determination filled his failing heart, he understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. The gods would not simply accept defeat. They would descend upon this clearing with all their accumulated fury, seeking to crush this rebellion before it could spread. The road back to his village, to the life he had known, was closed forever. There was only the path forward, into a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the 9 realms. The sky above the clearing split open like a wound, revealing depths that mortal eyes were never meant to witness. Through the tear in reality came the gods themselves, not the benevolent figures of village songs, but beings of terrible majesty whose very presence made the air burn with power that scorched Magnus's lungs with each desperate breath. Odin descended first, his ravens screaming prophecies of doom as lightning crawled across his weathered face. Behind him came Thor, hammer blazing with thunder fire, and Freya, her beauty so fierce it turned the snow to steam where her feet touched earth. They brought with them the weight of absolute authority, the crushing certainty that had ruled the 9 realms since time began. Enough! Odin's voice shattered ancient trees, sent the phantom warriors stumbling backward. This mockery ends now. Magnus felt their divine wrath pressing down like a mountain, threatening to crush him into nothing. Every instinct screamed at him to bow, to beg forgiveness, to accept whatever punishment they deemed fit. He was just a sickly 8-year-old boy who had wandered too far from safety. What right did he have to challenge beings who had shaped the very foundations of existence? But then Bjorn's strength flowed through their bond, carrying 3 centuries of defiant love. The phantom warriors pressed closer, their restored forms blazing with courage that had survived divine persecution. Most powerfully of all, Magnus felt his grandfather Eric's presence, the Stormcaller's spirit wrapping around him like a shield of starlight and memory. "Remember what you've learned," Eric's voice whispered. "About chains and freedom, about the difference between strength and power, about what it truly means to be brave." Magnus struggled to his feet, his small frame dwarfed by the assembled gods, but somehow not diminished. Blood still flowed from wounds that would never fully heal, but he stood straight as an oak sapling that refused to bend before the storm. "You're afraid," he said, his child's voice carrying impossible clearly through the divine thunder. "All this power, all this fury. You're terrified because you know love is stronger than fear." Thor's hammer sparked with killing light. "Impudent whelp. You will learn the price of defying—" "Stop!" Freya's command froze the thunder god mid-strike. Her terrible, beautiful eyes fixed on Magnus with something like recognition. "Look at him, truly look. See what he carries." Magnus felt the goddess's gaze pierce through flesh and bone to examine his spirit directly. What she found there made her step backward, genuine shock flickering across features that had remained unmoved by countless mortal pleas. "Impossible," she breathed. "The child bears the true mark." Odin's single eye narrowed dangerously. "What mark?" "The same one that branded Bjorn 3 centuries ago. The same one we branded as corruption and cast into darkness." Freya's voice carried wonder and growing horror. It was never corruption at all. It was love in its purest form, love that chooses sacrifice over safety, mercy over might. Through their bond, Magnus felt Bjorn's amazement as understanding blazed between them. The warrior's crime had never been breaking his oath, but fulfilling its deepest truth. He had chosen to protect love itself, rather than the laws that would crush it, and the gods had punished him not for betrayal but for showing them what they had forgotten. That true strength came from connection, not dominion. "You created the devourer," Magnus said, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. "You took love and called it weakness, twisted it into something monstrous, then used it to justify your rule through fear." The restored spirit that had once been the devourer pulsed with gentle light behind him, its presence a living testimony to what divine power could become when guided by compassion rather than conquest. The phantom warriors stood taller, their own transformations complete as they remembered what they had truly died defending. Odin's face darkened with wrath that could shatter mountains. "We maintain order. We preserve the natural way." "Whose nature?" Magnus challenged, drawing on everything he had learned in the moments between chains and freedom. "The nature that brings children to protect lost warriors. The nature that makes strangers choose sacrifice for love, or the nature that demands absolute obedience even when it destroys what you claim to protect." The God King raised Gungnir, his great spear that never missed its mark, divine power gathering around its point like a miniature sun. But as he prepared to strike, something unprecedented happened. The very air around Magnus began to sing. It was the song of every choice made for love rather than law, every moment when mortals had chosen connection over isolation. The phantom warriors joined their voices to it, then Bjorn's spirit, then Eric's, and beyond them came others, every soul throughout the 9 realms who had ever chosen mercy when might was easier. The gods faltered as their absolute authority met something they could not understand or defeat. The freely given love that asked nothing in return but the chance to protect what mattered most. Magnus stood at the center of it all, no longer just a sickly child, but the living embodiment of a truth that could reshape reality itself. That genuine strength came not from the power to dominate, but from the courage to love without condition. The final test had begun. The spear Gungnir blazed with the light of dying stars as Odin drew back his arm, divine fury incarnate. But as the weapon that had never missed its mark hurtled toward Magnus's heart, something extraordinary happened. The song of love that filled the clearing became a barrier more impenetrable than any shield ever forged. The spear struck and shattered into 1,000 fragments of crystalline light that scattered like tears across the snow. Odin staggered backward, his single eye wide with disbelief that bordered on terror. For the first time since the dawn of creation, his absolute power had been turned aside not by greater force, but by something infinitely gentler. "Impossible," Thor roared, his hammer crackling with enough lightning to level mountains. "No mortal power can withstand." "This isn't mortal power," Magnus interrupted, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had looked into the heart of existence and found it good. "This is what you've spent eternity trying to destroy. This is what happens when love chooses itself freely, without fear of punishment or promise of reward." The thunder god lunged forward, his massive form blazing with divine wrath, but the phantom warriors moved as one to intercede. Their restored spirits created a wall of shimmering light that sent Thor's hammer spinning harmlessly into the forest. The god crashed to his knees, staring at hands that had wielded cosmic forces since time began, now trembling with powerlessness. "You're not stronger than us," Freya said, but her voice carried wonder rather than anger. "You're not fighting us at all. You're showing us what we chose to forget." Magnus nodded, his small frame somehow containing the full weight of truth without being crushed by it. Through his bond with Bjorn, he felt the warrior's 3 centuries of suffering transforming into something radiant and healing. The pain was still there, but it had become sacred, not meaningless torment, but the price willingly paid to preserve something infinitely precious. "Love was never the enemy," Magnus said, taking a step toward the assembled gods. Each footfall left flowers blooming in the blood-stained snow, life springing forth where death had seemed certain. Fear was. The fear that if mortals truly loved without condition, they wouldn't need gods to tell them how. Odin's face contorted with rage, and something that might have been desperate grief. "We are order. We are the pillars that hold reality together. Without our law, without our dominion, without your fear," Magnus corrected gently, "there would still be love. But love doesn't need to destroy to prove its worth. It doesn't need subjects to justify its existence. It simply is, and in being, it makes everything else possible." The God King raised his hand, darkness gathering around his fingers like liquid midnight. But before he could unleash it, the transformed spirit that had once been the devourer stepped forward. Its form had stabilized into something breathtaking, a being of pure light whose presence made the very air sing with harmonies that predated divine law. "Remember," its voice whispered directly into the minds of the assembled gods. "Remember what you were. Before fear taught you that love was weakness. Remember the first song, the first joy, the first moment when existence chose connection over isolation." The effect was immediate and devastating. Freya gasped as memories flooded back, not the carefully curated history they had maintained for millennia, but the raw truth of their origins. They had once been servants of love, guardians of the bonds that held communities together, but somewhere in the vast expanse of eternity they had forgotten that power was meant to serve love, not the other way around. Thor's hammer fell from nerveless fingers as he experienced his own revelation. Every thunder he had ever called had been meant to clear storms for lovers meeting beneath open skies. Every battle he had fought was supposed to protect the gentle connections that made existence worthwhile. Instead, he had become an enforcer of isolation, using his strength to divide rather than unite. But it was Odin's transformation that shook the very foundations of reality. The All-Father's borrowed memories of wisdom and sacrifice crumbled away, revealing the terrified child god beneath, a being who had convinced himself that love's unpredictability was chaos that needed controlling. His ravens screamed and dissolved into motes of light as the lies that had sustained his dominion for eons finally collapsed. "What have we done?" he whispered, staring at hands that had chained love itself and called it justice. "What have we become?" Magnus felt the moment when the god's absolute certainty shattered completely. The phantom warriors stepped forward, not in conquest but in comfort, their spirits radiating the same forgiveness they had found for themselves. The clearing filled with light that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with understanding. "You became afraid," Magnus said simply, "but fear isn't forever. Love is." The boy extended his hand toward the fallen god king, his palm stained with blood from wounds that might never heal. In that gesture was everything the gods had spent millennia trying to suppress: mercy offered freely to those who had caused the most pain, love given without condition or guarantee of return. For the first time in 3 centuries, the possibility of true redemption blazed across the 9 realms like a newborn star. Odin stared at Magnus's outstretched hand as if it were a serpent poised to strike. The All-Father's single eye darted between the boy's blood-stained palm and his face, searching for some trace of deception, some hidden agenda that would make sense of this impossible offering. But there was nothing, only genuine compassion radiating from a child who had every reason to demand vengeance. "Why?" Odin's voice cracked like ancient ice. "After everything we've done, why would you show us mercy?" Magnus felt the weight of that question settle over the clearing like fresh snow. Through his bond with Bjorn, he sensed the warrior's own wonder at the moment. 3 centuries of suffering had led to this singular choice between perpetuating the cycle of divine retribution or breaking it forever. "Because," Magnus said, his young voice carrying the weight of absolute truth, "someone has to choose love first, even when. Especially when. It costs everything." The words hung in the air like crystalline music, and Magnus felt something shift deep within his chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with his mortal body began spreading outward, touching first Bjorn through their bond, then the phantom warriors, then the transformed spirit of light, and finally reaching toward the fallen gods themselves. But as the warmth grew stronger, Magnus realized with dawning horror what was happening. The love he carried, pure and unconditional, was too vast for his small mortal frame. His 8-year-old heart, already strained beyond endurance, began to flutter like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. Blood flowed more freely from his wounds as his spirit prepared to pour itself out completely in this final act of mercy. "Magnus, no." Bjorn's anguished cry echoed through their bond. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." The boy's response carried infinite gentleness even as his legs buckled beneath him. "This is what love looks like. Not the safe kind that protects itself first, but the kind that gives everything and asks nothing back." Magnus sank to his knees in the snow, but his hand remained extended toward Odin. The light flowing from him grew brighter, washing over the gods like a tide of forgiveness they had never thought to seek. Thor's hammer dissolved entirely, its violence transformed into something that nurtured rather than destroyed. Freya's terrible beauty softened into something approachable, maternal, protective of vulnerability rather than commanding worship. And Odin. The god king felt his ravens returning, but changed. No longer harbingers of doom, they carried messages of hope between the separated, songs of reunion to the lost. His spear Gungnir reformed in his hand, but its point had become rounded, its purpose shifted from striking down to lifting up. "The boy is dying," Freya whispered, her voice breaking with newfound emotion. "His mortal form cannot contain such pure love." Magnus heard her words from a great distance. His vision was fading, but not into darkness, into a light so warm and welcoming that fear seemed impossible. Through it all, he felt his grandfather Eric's presence drawing closer, arms opening to welcome him home to whatever lay beyond the veil of mortal existence. "I'm not afraid," he told Bjorn, though each thought required tremendous effort. "I found what I was looking for. I found the way to break the chains." The phantom warriors pressed closer, their restored forms flickering between realms as they witnessed something unprecedented. A mortal child sacrificing himself not to defeat enemies, but to redeem them. Their own transformations deepened, the last shadows of their divine curse burning away in the light of Magnus's selfless love. But it was the transformed devourer who spoke the truth that shattered the silence. He is not dying. He is becoming. Magnus felt it then, his mortal flesh falling away not in death but in transcendence. The love he had chosen to embody was remaking him into something beyond the reach of divine law, beyond the cycle of punishment and retribution that had ruled the 9 realms since their creation. He was becoming a living bridge between what was and what could be. "Choose," he whispered to the gods, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated across dimensions. "Fear or love, control or connection, the old ways that demand submission, or new ways that invite participation." Odin's hand trembled as he reached toward Magnus's still-extended palm. The moment their skin touched, the All-Father gasped as centuries of accumulated fear and rage drained away like poison from a wound. In its place came something he had thought lost forever: the joy of relationship freely chosen rather than commanded. "We choose love," Odin said, and his words rewrote the fundamental laws of existence itself. Magnus smiled as his transformation completed, his sacrifice becoming the cornerstone of a new reality where gods and mortals would meet as partners rather than subjects. The cost had been everything he was, but what he was becoming would heal wounds that had festered since the dawn of time. The victory was won, but its price would echo through the 9 realms forever. The silence that followed Odin's declaration stretched like the held breath of creation itself. Magnus, no longer quite the frail child who had wandered into the forest that morning, felt the fundamental structures of reality reshaping themselves around his transformed presence. The ancient oak that had served as Bjorn's prison for 3 centuries began to bloom despite the winter cold, its branches reaching toward a sky that suddenly seemed less distant, less wrathful. Bjorn stepped forward, his massive frame trembling as he knelt beside what remained of the boy who had saved them all. The warrior's scarred hands hovered uncertainly over Magnus's luminous form, afraid to touch something so sacred, yet desperate to maintain their connection. "Little brother," Bjorn whispered, his voice breaking with grief and wonder. "What have you done?" Magnus turned toward his friend, and though his features had become something between mortal and divine, his smile remained achingly familiar. "I kept my promise," he said softly. "I freed you, all of you." The phantom warriors began to fade, but not into oblivion, into peace. Their forms dissolved like morning mist, finally released from the curse that had bound them to rage and vengeance. As they departed, each spirit pressed close to Magnus, their gratitude flowing through him like warm honey. The last to go was a young shield maiden who had died defending her village 300 years ago. She touched Magnus's forehead with fingers like starlight. "Thank you," she breathed, "for showing us that we could choose love over anger, even in death." Thor retrieved his reformed hammer with shaking hands, staring at its transformed surface, as if seeing his own reflection for the first time. The weapon felt lighter now, its purpose clarified. No longer an instrument of divine wrath, it had become a tool for building bridges, for protecting the gentle connections between souls that made existence meaningful. "I remember," the thunder god said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I remember what we were meant to be." Freya knelt in the snow beside Odin, her divine beauty no longer terrible but welcoming. The goddess of love had spent so long commanding worship that she had forgotten the simple joy of offering comfort freely given. Now she wept openly for all the connections her pride had severed, all the hearts she had hardened in her name. "The villages," she said suddenly, urgency cutting through her grief. "Magnus, the curse, the transformation. "Is already lifting," he assured her, his awareness expanding far beyond the clearing. Across the frozen landscape, Magnus could feel the unnatural hunger leaving his people, their humanity returning like warmth after a long winter. His father would wake to find his rage replaced by wonder. His mother would discover that her fear had transformed into fierce protective love. The entire clan would emerge from their homes to find the world remade around them. But the changes went deeper than mere restoration. The love Magnus had embodied was spreading through the 9 realms like ripples on still water, touching every corner of existence. In distant halls, gods were remembering their original purposes. In mortal villages, ancient grudges were dissolving into forgiveness. The barriers between divine and human were becoming permeable, allowing for genuine partnership rather than fearful subjugation. Odin remained on his knees, his single eye fixed on Magnus with an expression of profound humility. The All-Father, who had once commanded absolute obedience, now looked like what he had always been beneath the accumulated fears, a being desperate to understand his place in the vast tapestry of existence. "The price," Odin said quietly. "You paid such a terrible price for our redemption." Magnus considered this, his transformed consciousness touching the edges of truths too vast for words. "Love always costs everything," he replied, "but it also gives everything back. I'm not lost, Odin. I'm just bigger now, big enough to hold space for all of us to grow." The transformed spirit that had once been the devourer pulsed with gentle light, its presence a constant reminder of what divine power could become when guided by compassion. It settled near Magnus like a guardian, its purpose now clear, to help maintain the balance between old wisdom and new understanding. Bjorn's bond with Magnus thrummed with bittersweet recognition. Their connection had not been severed by the boy's transformation, but it had changed. Where once there had been the simple love between a lonely child and a protective warrior, now there existed something approaching the sacred, a bridge between mortal experience and divine understanding. "What happens now?" Bjorn asked, voicing the question that hung heavy in the transformed air. Magnus smiled, and in that expression was all the wonder of a child discovering that the world was even more magical than he had dared imagine. "Now we learn," he said simply. "We learn what it means to love without fear, to have power without dominion, to be connected without losing ourselves." The clearing fell quiet again, but it was a different silence now. Not the terrible hush before divine judgment, but the peaceful pause before a new song began. In the distance, the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, and with them came the promise of a world where gods and mortals might finally learn to dance together rather than apart. The resolution was complete, but the true adventure was just beginning. The return. The journey back to the village began as the dawn light painted the snow in shades of gold and rose. Magnus moved differently now, not with the hesitant steps of a sickly child, but with the measured grace of something both more and less than human. His feet left prints that bloomed with tiny flowers even in the frozen earth, a living testament to the transformation that had remade him from within. Bjorn walked beside him, the warrior's massive frame casting protective shadows that no longer spoke of violence, but of shelter freely offered. The chains that had bound him for 3 centuries had left no marks. His flesh bore only the scars of choices made from love, and these had become beautiful, like silver thread woven through bronze. "Are you ready?" Magnus asked, as they crested the final hill overlooking their home. Below them, the village stirred with the cautious movements of people awakening from a nightmare they couldn't quite remember. Smoke rose from chimneys in gentle spirals, and Magnus could sense the confusion radiating from his people as they tried to understand what had happened to the rage that had consumed them only hours before. "Are you?" Bjorn countered, his scarred hand finding the boy's shoulder. The touch sent warmth through both of them, their bond humming with affection that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine. Magnus nodded, though he felt the weight of what awaited them. He was no longer the frightened child who had fled into the forest to escape his family's disappointment. The love he had chosen to embody had changed him in ways that went beyond his transformed nature. he carried within himself the knowledge of what mortals and gods alike were capable of when fear no longer ruled their hearts. The first person to spot them was Astrid, Magnus's younger sister, who had been gathering eggs from their chickens. She dropped her basket with a crash that sent the hens scattering, her mouth falling open as she stared at her brother. Where once she had seen only weakness, now she perceived something that made her soul sing with recognition. "Magnus," she whispered, then louder, "Magnus." Her cry brought others running. Their mother, Sigrid, appeared in the doorway of their home, her face pale with the memory of emotions she couldn't quite grasp. When she saw her son approaching with the massive warrior beside him, her expression cycled through confusion, fear, and finally, wonder. "My boy," she breathed, taking tentative steps forward. "What has happened to you?" Magnus smiled, and in that expression was all the love he had always felt for her, but had never known how to show. "I found what I was looking for in the forest, Mother. I found the way to bring our family home." Behind Sigrid came Magnus's father, Gunnar, moving with the uncertain gait of a man whose rage had been his compass for so long that he no longer knew which direction to face. The clan leader's eyes fixed on Bjorn with instinctive wariness, but when he looked at his son, something crumbled in his weathered features. "I remember being angry with you," Gunnar said slowly, as if testing the words. "But I cannot remember why. When I try to recall it, all I feel is—" He paused, struggling with emotions he had thought buried beyond recovery. "Love, grief for time lost, fear that I have failed you as a father." Magnus stepped forward and, for the first time in years, embraced his father without hesitation. Gunnar's arms closed around his transformed son with desperate gentleness, and both of them felt the barriers that had divided them dissolving like morning frost. "You haven't failed me, father," Magnus murmured against Gunnar's chest. "We all just forgot how to see each other clearly. But forgetting isn't forever." One by one, the clan members emerged from their homes, drawn by some instinct they couldn't name. Magnus's grandfather, Eric, bent with age but moving with renewed purpose, hobbled forward with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Grandson," he said simply. And in that single word was all the pride and love he had always carried, but had been too afraid to express. "You've grown." Magnus laughed, the sound carrying harmonics that made the very air shimmer with joy. "Inside and out, grandfather, but I'm still me. I'm still your Magnus who asks too many questions and wants to fix everything." "And can you?" asked Astrid, her young voice carrying hope that cut straight through the heart. "Fix everything, I mean?" Magnus looked around at his family, his clan, his people who had been transformed by divine curse into something monstrous, only to be restored by love that asked nothing in return. He felt Bjorn's presence beside him like an anchor to his humanity, even as his consciousness touched the edges of divine understanding. "I can't fix everything," he admitted, "but I learned something important in the forest. Love doesn't fix things the way we think it should. It doesn't make problems disappear or guarantee happy endings, but it makes us brave enough to face whatever comes next. Together." As the morning sun climbed higher, the village began to truly wake up for the first time in generations, not just from sleep, but from the long nightmare of fear that had divided them from each other and from the divine forces that shaped their world. The boy who had left as an outcast had returned as a bridge, and through him all things were becoming possible. The new beginning. 3 months had passed since the morning Magnus returned from the forest, and the village had settled into rhythms that would have seemed impossible in the old world. The boy who had bridged mortal and divine now spent his days much as any child might, helping with chores, playing with his sister, asking the endless questions that had always marked him as different. Yet everything was transformed by the love that flowed through him like light through clear water. Magnus knelt in the garden behind their home, his transformed hands coaxing life from soil that had been frozen only weeks before. Beside him, Astrid planted seeds with the intense concentration of a 7-year-old determined to prove herself capable of miracles too. "Will they really grow this big?" she asked. holding up the drawing Magnus had made of the sunflowers they were planting. Blooms taller than a man, faces bright as small suns. "If we tend them with love," Magnus replied, and meant it literally. Where his fingers touched the earth, tiny shoots of green were already beginning to emerge. Everything grows better when it feels wanted. Bjorn approached from the direction of the forge, his massive frame now a familiar and welcome sight throughout the village. The warrior had taken to helping wherever hands were needed, his supernatural strength a blessing for construction, his centuries of experience invaluable for solving problems. The children no longer ran from him in fear. Instead, they followed him around like devoted puppies, begging for stories of distant lands and ancient battles. "Your father wants to speak with you," Bjorn said, settling onto the ground beside them with careful grace. Even sitting, he towered over Magnus, but there was nothing intimidating about his presence now. The scars that covered his flesh had become silver and beautiful, telling stories of love chosen over easier paths. Magnus felt a flutter of the old anxiety, then let it pass through him without taking root. His relationship with Gunnar was still growing, still healing from years of mutual disappointment and misunderstanding, but they were learning to see each other clearly, and that made all the difference. He found his father standing at the edge of the village, looking out toward the forest with an expression Magnus couldn't quite read. Gunnar had aged in these past months, but not from weariness, rather from the weight of joy that came from truly seeing his family for the first time in years. "The other clan leaders have been sending messengers," Gunnar said without preamble. "Word of what happened here has spread. They want to see the boy who spoke with gods and lived. Some come seeking wisdom. Others—" He paused, his weathered hands clenching at his sides. "Others come seeking power." Magnus nodded, unsurprised. His awareness extended far beyond their small village now, and he had felt the ripples of change spreading across the land. Some welcomed the new world where love ruled over fear. Others resented the loss of the old certainties, the familiar structures of dominance and submission. "What do you think I should do?" Magnus asked. Gunnar turned to study his son. This strange, wonderful child who bore divinity like a comfortable cloak while still getting mud on his clothes and forgetting to wash his face. "I think," he said slowly, "that you should do what you have always done. Follow your heart, ask impossible questions, and trust that love will show you the way." That evening, the clan gathered around the great fire that burned in the center of their settlement. It was a new tradition, born from the understanding that isolation bred fear while connection fostered courage. Magnus sat between his parents. Astrid curled sleepily against his side, while Bjorn occupied a place of honor among the adults who had once viewed outsiders with suspicion. Old Eric cleared his throat, commanding attention with the authority of his years. "We have lived through something that will be remembered in songs long after our bones have returned to earth," he began, his voice carrying the cadence of a born storyteller. "But tonight, I want to speak not of gods and curses, but of a small boy who saw chains and chose to break them." Magnus felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he didn't protest. He had learned to accept praise just as he had learned to transform suffering, by letting it flow through him without resistance. "The world beyond our borders grows restless," Eric continued. "They will come seeking what they think we possess: power, secrets, the favor of gods. But what we truly offer is something far more dangerous to those who rule through fear." His eyes found Magnus in the firelight, sparkling with fierce pride. "We offer the possibility that things can be different." As the fire burned low and the stories ended, Magnus walked with Bjorn to the edge of the forest. The ancient oak where the warrior had been imprisoned stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, its branches heavy with impossible blossoms that perfumed the air with hope. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Bjorn asked. Magnus smiled, his transformed features peaceful in the moonlight. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together, and that makes anything possible." In the distance, travelers' fires flickered between the trees, some bringing curiosity, others bringing hunger for power. The new world was still fragile, still contested by those who preferred the certainties of the old ways. But Magnus had learned the deepest truth of all. Love, once chosen, could not be unchosen. It would spread and grow and transform everything it touched, one heart at a time, until the whole world remembered what it meant to be connected rather than conquered. The boy who had found a warrior chained to a tree had discovered something far more valuable. He had found the key to setting everyone free.